By 1982, Argentina's ruling military junta faced the crisis of confidence. Public support for the military regime had turned into widespread opposition because of government corruption, human rights violations, and an economic recession. The staunchly anti-communist junta had come to power in a coup in 1976 and then brutally quelled a leftist insurgency in the Dirty War with lawful as well as underhanded methods. As military abuses became exposed, the international community put pressure on Argentina to implement reforms. Rather, the junta drew up a plan to seize possession of the British-controlled Falkland Islands on the promise that if successful, local support for the Argentine government would be restored. This particularly since Argentina had a long-standing historical claim to the Falklands, which was a source of intense nationalistic fervor among Argentines, a sentiment the government was determined to exploit. The invasion plan was predicated on the following interrelated premises. 1. It would not likely elicit a British military response, as the Falklands were small, seemingly inconsequential, and too far away. 2. In 1976, Britain had not militarily responded when Argentine forces occupied the uninhabited British Southern Thule Islands. 3. Britain was in the midst of a recession and had cut back on military spending. 4. After World War II, Britain had pursued decolonization that saw it end colonial rule in its vast empire. And with regards to the Falklands, with UN encouragement, Britain and Argentina held talks to determine its future. Although nothing substantial emerged, both sides agreed to collaborate on a number of commercial ventures. However, the flaw to the plan was that Falklanders had made it known to Britain that they wished to remain under British rule. Consequently, Britain decided to defer its decision on the Falklands, and any resolution would have to consider the wishes of the Falklanders. By March 1982, the Argentine military had completed its invasion plan, which envisaged first seizing South Georgia Island. On March 19, 1982, in South Georgia Island, the Argentine flag was raised by Argentine contract workers, who were then arrested by British authorities. A flurry of diplomatic exchanges followed, which led on April 3, 1982, to fighting breaking out, with Argentine forces capturing the island. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces landed in Port Stanley, the Falklands capital, easily overcame the island's small British garrison, and quickly brought the islands under Argentine control. An Argentine military command was formed to administer the islands, and British authorities and Falklanders were given the option to leave with compensation. In Britain, the government was taken by surprise, despite being aware of the Argentine capture of South Georgia Island, which British authorities failed to see was part of a larger Argentine operation. As Britain had no contingency plan for such an eventuality, it scrambled to form from all available sources a task force of land, sea, and air units. On April 5, 1982, the completed task force aboard a fleet of 93 ships set off from Britain for the South Atlantic Ocean with a plan to first achieve air and naval superiority in the Falklands before launching a ground operation. Britain also used diplomatic efforts in the international stage, initiating a Security Council resolution calling on Argentina to withdraw from the Falklands. The British government used other diplomatic channels in the meantime that its forces were yet continuing their 3-week journey to the South Atlantic. On April 19, 1982, the British task force reached the waters of the Falklands. Combat action first took place in South Georgia Island, where British Marines were landed, backed by shipborne artillery that bombarded Argentine positions. 4 days later, the British recaptured the island. On May 1, 1982, the British launched operations to recapture the Falklands, conducting air attacks on Port Stanley Airport. The British Navy also established a 200-mile exclusion zone around the Falklands, which was challenged by the Argentine Navy, which sent out 2 flotillas of ships steered north and south of the Falklands to trap and destroy the British fleet. On May 2, 1982, a torpedo attack from a British submarine sank the ARA Belgrano, forcing the Argentine Navy to order its ships to return to port, where they remained for the rest of the war. Argentine planes struck back on May 4, 1982, sinking the British destroyer HMS Sheffield. Despite not having achieved total control of the sky, the British decided to start ground operations because deteriorating weather conditions indicated that the harsh South Atlantic winter was approaching. On May 21, 1982, British forces were landed at San Carlos Bay, a lightly defended area, having ruled out a direct attack on heavily fortified Port Stanley because of the likelihood of incurring heavy casualties. At San Carlos, the small Argentine garrison was overpowered, and British transport ships arrived and unloaded weapons and supplies. Argentine planes launched many sorties, sinking and damaging many British ships. British forces consolidated their positions and then headed out on foot over the 80-kilometer distance to Port Stanley. To protect the right flank of the advance, a contingent was sent to capture Goose Green, which, unbeknownst to the British, was defended by a large Argentine force. In the ensuing battle on May 27 to 28, 1982, a British flanking maneuver with close air support forced the Argentines to surrender. Meanwhile, the main British force soon reached Teal Inlet on their northern advance to Port Stanley. In June 1982, British forces were also landed at Bluff Cove and Fitzroy, aimed at opening the southern advance to Port Stanley. Argentine planes again wreaked havoc, causing heavy British casualties and sinking 2 vessels and damaging 2 others. But the British completed the landing and the ground forces, the northern and southern advance, now totaling 10,000 troops, set out for Port Stanley. Opposing them was a force of also 10,000 Argentine troops, comprising mostly new conscripts but soon reinforced with more experienced soldiers. On May 31, 1982, the British captured Mount Kent, eliminating the threat to their northern force. The British then came to within the western approaches to Port Stanley, comprising 2 rings which Argentine forces had fortified. On June 11, 1982, British forces attacked the first ring of hills, opening an artillery barrage and then ground units fighting their way up the heights. Before dawn, they had captured their objectives. On June 13, 1982, the British advanced into the second ring of hills, with their artillery particularly devastating, and by early the next day, forcing the Argentines to retreat in disarray toward Port Stanley. On June 14, 1982, British forces encircled Port Stanley from land and sea, forcing the Argentine military governor to surrender. Thereafter, the British regained control of the Falklands. On June 20, 1982, a British naval force arrived in the southern Thule, also expelling the Argentines there. The war had opposite effects in Britain and Argentina. In Britain, in elections held in 1983, victory in the Falklands led to a landslide victory for Prime Minister Thatcher, whose government had earlier trailed badly in the polls and were headed for defeat. In Argentina, early in the war, the military government had gained widespread public support when the Argentine army seized the Falklands. But with defeat and expulsion of the Argentine military from the islands, massive protests and riots broke out, the ignominy of defeat leading to the end of the military government. Thereafter, Argentina began to transition to democracy, and in elections held in 1983, a civilian government took office. To this day, despite its defeat, Argentina continues to pursue its claim of ownership to the Falklands.